Could the striking contours of a face predict a twisted future? Tonight, we peer into the disturbing visage of Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, whose high cheekbones and intense gaze became symbols of terror across California in the mid-1980s. We'll read into the controversial and often discredited field of phrenology and determine if we can apply its hypotheses to the chilling case of the Night Stalker. Phrenology is a theory that emerged in the early 1800s, claiming that the bumps on a person's skull and their facial features could determine their moral and intellectual faculties. High cheekbones, for instance, were once thought to indicate certain personality traits. What turns a man into a monster? Tonight, we seek answers about the criminal tendencies that enveloped Richard Ramirez, whose terrifying spree held California in the grip of fear. Join us as we trace his path from an abused child to one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, Richard Ramirez was one of 5 children in a Mexican-American family. His childhood was marred by physical abuse and head injuries, and around the age of 12, he would have suffered seizures, and other times he would just stare off into space as he experienced these seizures. The doctors told his family that he would grow out of it, and eventually he did. However, up to the age of 13, Richard did comparatively well in school with better-than-average grades, but in the 7th grade things started to go downhill. According to his sister, when Richard was arbitrarily thrown off the football team, his pride was very hurt. Richard had been very proud of being a good quarterback and felt it was very unfair of the coach to drop him from the team because he had an occasional blackout from the epilepsy. At this time, Richard Ramirez became significantly influenced by his older cousin, Miguel "Mike" Valles, a Vietnam War veteran. Mike had a profound and disturbing impact on Ramirez from a young age. After returning from the war, Mike would share graphic and violent stories with Ramirez, often boasting about the brutal acts he committed against Vietnamese women, including rape and murder. He also showed Ramirez Polaroid photos of these heinous acts, which, rather than repulsing him, fascinated Ramirez and fueled his later criminal behaviors. Mike also taught Ramirez military tactics, such as stealth and kill methods, which Ramirez later adapted for his own criminal activities. This early exposure to extreme violence and the normalization of such behaviors were foundational in shaping Ramirez's outlook and behaviors, ultimately contributing to his development into a serial killer. The following year, Ramirez was a witness to his cousin's fatal shooting of his wife. Around this time, Ramirez began breaking into homes. After dropping out of high school, he moved to Los Angeles. He continued to commit crimes and was briefly imprisoned for stealing a car. This highly successful killer and sadist took Richard under his wing and taught him how to kill and fight. Mike's wife Jessie was alarmed at what Mike had become during the war. She didn't need a husband who did nothing but brag about his wartime brutalities and sexual conquests, smoke pot, and hang around with Richard. Disagreements between the two became more and more heated, and one day, in front of Richard, Mike shot his wife in the face. Mike went to trial for the murder, but pleaded temporary insanity. With his impressive war record, Mike was dealt with leniently and was committed to a mental hospital. Mike's influence on Richard was indelible. His interest in school had vanished, and all the 13-year-old boy cared about was getting high on pot. He went to Los Angeles to live for the summer with his brother Ruben, who was a heroin addict and a burglar. There was only one objective now: stealing money to get high. At the point when he returned to El Paso, the conflicts with his dad turned out to be more predominant. Julian was crushed to see his most youthful child going down some unacceptable way. Richard considered his dad to be a dictator. The two of them, similar to all of the Ramirez men, had awful hazardous attitudes. In the long run, he moved in with his sister Ruth and her better half Roberta. Richard had forever been to some degree hyperactive and required next to no rest. "My sibling never dozed," Ruth said. "He was up the entire night constantly. He was one of those individuals who worked with a couple of long stretches of rest." During this time of his life, Richard began taking LSD and other psychedelic medications. Simultaneously, he began envisioning that he was becoming one with Satan. He considered himself to be a supporter of Satan. While he was in secondary school, he found a new line of work with a lodging and approached an expert key. He started breaking into the rooms while the visitors were dozing so he could take their assets. He was cautious enough so nobody associated intermittent robberies with his admittance to the passkey. He became fixated on the delightful ladies in the inn. Frequently, he would slip into the room and take cover behind the weighty drapes so he could watch them strip down. He fantasized about sex with these ladies until his dreams ejected into an attack. He went into the lady's room, shocked her from behind, tied her up and continued to assault her when her significant other came into the room and thumped Richard to the ground. Richard was just 15 and the appointed authority was merciful. He moved away with practically no probation. Indeed, even his folks were willfully ignorant and trusted his story. Cousin Mike escaped the psychological emergency clinic toward the finish of 1977 and begun spending time with Richard once more. At that point, Richard had turned into an extremely compelling criminal and hoodlum. From Mike, he learned endurance strategies and how to be extreme. Beside his cousin, he considered himself to be a maverick in a threatening out-of-line world. At the point when Richard turned 18 out of 1978, he left his home in El Paso and set out toward Los Angeles. His main advantages were drugs, sexual dreams, and the weighty metal music which he paid attention to consistently. Philip Carlo portrays the risky young fellow that he had become. He was attracted to melodic gatherings, whose rhythms were hard-driving, and whose verses had something to do with his deepest contemplations on religion and sex. He, at this point, not had faith in the Catholic Church. Extreme, vicious sexual pictures filled Richard's head. For such contemplations, Jesus Christ, he knew, would despise him and ensure he went to damnation and remained there until the end of time. Not at all like Jesus. Satan wouldn't hate him, however, embrace him and give him comfort, insurance, and understanding. Once in Los Angeles, Richard at first remained with his sibling Reuben until both of them had a run-in over Reuben's better half. Richard turned into a cocaine junkie and upheld himself by robbery. He had no typical romantic associations with ladies. In the long run, Richard began subbing PCP or Heavenly Messenger dust for cocaine. It just extended his forceful and crazy episodes. At some point, he vented his hostility on another fiend. He tied her up, ripped off her garments, and assaulted her multiple times, excited by his control over her. It was a significant second in his dream life, and he longed for more. At this time, Richard started learning about Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan in San Francisco. He felt compelled to join their rituals, preferred to be what he termed a lone practitioner. This belief in Satan was not just a whimsy, but a deep-seated belief in the power of Lucifer to protect and empower his disciples. He admitted this to his sister when she visited him in LA and was alarmed at the changes in him. "Why Satan, Richie?" she wanted to know. "Because Satan represents what I feel. I'm not like other people. I'm different. I've got a trade. I'm a thief, Ruth, and a good one. I'm not going to any jail. I'm protected." As a teenager, Ramirez's life began to spiral out of control. He embraced drugs, cultivated an interest in Satanism, and started to manifest a growing fascination with V. By the mid-1980s, Ramirez had escalated to serial burglary, sexual assault, and murder. His method was brutal and random, choosing victims across California, from elderly couples to young women. He often entered homes at night, attacking residents while they slept, leaving communities paralyzed with fear. In June 1984, Ramirez committed his first known murder, raping and stabbing a 79-year-old widow. In 2009, he was implicated in the April 1984 murder of a 9-year-old girl after his DNA was determined to be at the crime scene. However, Ramirez was not charged with the crime. He then apparently waited some 8 months before resuming his killings. Stalking with Satan. Police composites had been produced of the killer, compiled from descriptions from those few who lived to tell of their attack and from witnesses who had seen the shooting of Tsai Lian Yu on Alhambra Avenue. With minor variations, the suspect was of Hispanic descent, about 25 to 30 years old, wore long, unkempt black hair that hung in greasy strands over a high forehead and which straggled down across a skeletally thin, pockmarked face. Cheekbones were sunken, lips thick, chin square. According to Ruth Wilson, his teeth were jagged and rotten. The description wasn't a pretty one, and it fit the face of the monster he was. Each testimony had him dressed in all black. His appearance was so inclined towards the theory of phrenology, but of course no scientific evidence was delineated to this effect. Therefore, squads continued to roll throughout the city and accompanying suburbs. Policemen watched steadfastly night and day for anyone even closely fitting that description, but didn't find their man. And in the meantime, his crimes continued without a sign of let-up, his ferocity building. The nature of the next attack, which occurred on June 1st, the day after the assault on Wilson, added another and an alarmingly new perspective to the suspect. He suddenly took on the role of a Satanist and his deeds as sacrificial rituals to the Lord Master of Evil. It would be his most aggressive and horrific action to date. Retired schoolteacher Malvia Keller and invalid sister Blanche Wolfe, 83 and 79 years old respectively, were viciously beaten in their small house in suburban Monrovia, off one of the central state freeways. When found by their gardener the following morning, both elderly women had been beaten across the head with a hammer. Wolfe lay near the point of death, oozing blood from a head wound. She had been raped. Keller, who had succumbed, had had her legs and arms bound and had been crushed by a heavy table, which the killer had turned over across her ribs. Police found a pentagram, an encircled five-pointed star often linked to satanic worship drawn in lipstick on Malvia Keller's thigh, writes Clifford L. Leindecker in his Night Stalker. Another pentagram had been crudely scrawled in lipstick on the bedroom wall, where Blanche Wolfe lay in a comatose state. The tip of the pentagram was inverted, pointing down, an indication of evil, of Satan. This indication of devil worship was no surprise to Los Angeles County Sheriff Sherman Block, who had for some time suspected the crimes to be of that origin. A black baseball-style cap bearing the emblem of the hard rock group AC/DC, found at the scene of Dale Okazaki's murder, had given him that impression. That music group was known for having produced some lyrics with cultist overtones. Block had seen enough murder in his years as a police officer to recognize the differences between homicides of various degrees: drug-related, love triangle, cultist, and so on. But Ramirez's capture was difficult. The devil's own remained elusive, and that's all that mattered, unfortunately. It had now become apparent that, like a vampire of folklore, the demon had grown more degenerate with every sip of blood. Over the next 6 weeks, the Los Angeles area would endure a series of killings so brutal that the city was thrown into a panic. No lock was sufficient in the minds of the frightened public. Because the killer's victims ranged all ages, no one felt safe. Some of his victims were of Oriental culture, others were Caucasian, and the city wondered, who the hell next? Some writers claimed that the killer, who by all eyewitness testimony was believed to be Hispanic, had not picked on his own. Yet they forgot Maria Hernandez, whose key ring had saved her life on a mid-March morning. The killer had not exhibited a rabid preference for any particular culture, age group, sex, or even geographic area. His killing spanned a 40-mile range encircling Greater LA. He was, as Leindecker observes, an equal opportunity killer. Over the next 6 weeks, the Los Angeles area would endure a series of killings so brutal that the city was thrown into a panic that took on the appearance of a cataclysm. Many sleepless nights were had by citizens, especially by women who lived alone. No lock was sufficient in the minds of the frightened public. No door bolt thick enough, no window latch secure enough. The press named Ramirez as the Night Stalker. On August 17th, Ramirez struck in San Francisco, his most horrific assault outside LA, killing Peter Scott, 66, and severely beating and his wife. Though she endured her injuries, she distinguished the stalker from police portrayals taken from the previous survivors. Then, on August 24th, Ramirez wounds Bill Carnes, 29. After that, he raped Inez Erickson, Carnes' fiancée. Miraculously, Erickson noticed Ramirez's car as he left. It was an orange Toyota station cart. A young also neighbor then provides details of the vehicle and its driver. The police are notified that the number plate he had been taken down. On August 30th, police found the vehicle deserted. They removed a single fingerprint from it. Ramirez was distinguished. They gave an APB for Ramirez, and his mugshots were displayed on public television. The following day, Ramirez's image was on the front of each and every significant paper in the state, and on each television news notice. When Ramirez entered a liquor store and saw himself staring at him from that day's newspaper, he was unaware of this. Ramirez terrified as different clients understood that it was him. Eventually, a fingerprint was discovered that led to Ramirez's identification. On August 30th, 1985, 6 days after his last known murder, Ramirez's name and photograph were released to the public, and the following day a man in East Los Angeles saw him and notified police. A chase ensued, and as Ramirez tried to steal a car, he was surrounded by a crowd and beaten until police arrived. The Night Stalker, as the killer became known, who had created a panic that saw a surge in gun sales, was captured. During a long trial, his twisted thought process was exposed. Whether it was his biological appearance, his earlier life experience, or his satanic beliefs, Ramirez was extremely cold-blooded, simply evil. "You know who I am, don't you? I'm the one they're writing about in the newspapers and on TV," as said to Inez Erickson prior to the first rape. "I love Satan." Ramirez made Inez Erickson say this to him as he was raping her for the second time. "I've killed 20 people, man. I love all that blood," bragging in jail. "I love to kill people. I love watching them die. I would shoot them in the head and they would wiggle and squirm all over the place and then just stop. Or I would cut them with a knife and watch their faces turn real white. I love all that blood. I told one lady to give me all her money. She said no. So I cut her and pulled her eyes out," told the Deputy Sheriff Jim Ellis. "It's nothing you'd understand, but I do have something to say. In fact, I have a lot to say, but now is not the time or place. I don't know why I'm wasting my time or breath. But what the hell? As for what is said of my life, there have been lies in the past and there will be lies in the future. I don't believe in the hypocritical, moralistic dogma of this so-called civilized society. I need not look beyond this room to see all the liars, the killers, the crooks, the paranoid cowards, truly trematodes of the earth, each one in his own legal profession. Throughout, the defense and prosecuting lawyers often became inveigled in vocal squabbles apart from the formal proceedings. The defense accused the court of bias, and the prosecution claimed outwardly that the defense's demeanor in court was anything but respectful to the bench. The defendant himself was totally void of comportment. Judge Nelson repeatedly was forced to warn him to subdue his erratic behavior, his incessant displays of contempt towards opposing counsel and witnesses. Messrs. Hernandez, the court noted, were not supportive of the court, for they often joked and jibed along with Ramirez at the counsel table. Ramirez laughed a lot and joked with his attorneys, even cackling loudly during crucial testimony, states Leyendecker. Once he laughed loudly during a young widow's testimony, had caused several spectators to cry as she tearfully described how her assailant had raped and beaten her while her slain husband lay nearby. Sometimes Ramirez sneered openly at the prosecution. On September 20th, 1989, Ramirez was convicted of all 43 charges, 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. During the penalty phase of the trial on November 7th, 1989, he was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. He stated to reporters after the death sentences, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Richard Ramirez died in 2013, but the memory of his crimes remains. His life story raises uneasy questions about nature versus nurture, mental health, and the roots of evil. Experts believe that Ramirez's criminal behavior was the result of a complex interplay of psychological, environmental, and possibly genetic factors, rather than his physical appearance. His unsettling calm and charismatic manipulation during the trial fascinated the public and psychology experts alike. Share your comments, and hey, do subscribe for more. Till then, stay safe and stay curious.